As a young man, Bush served in the U.S. Army and may have participated in the Battle of New Orleans during the War of 1812. Bush eventually settled in Clay County, Missouri, where he met Isabella or Isabel James, a young German-American woman. They were married on July 4, 1831. William Owen Bush, the first of their 6 sons, was born exactly 1 year later. 4 more sons, Joseph Talbot, Ryle Bailey, Henry Stanford, and Jackson January, were born before the family headed west in 1844. Bush farmed and raised cattle, and the family was relatively well off. However, the state of Missouri had laws that forbid free African Americans from entering the state. Discrimination was increasing in the years leading up to the Civil War. At the same time, in the late 1830s and 1840s, reports from the first U.S. residents to cross the continent and settle in the Oregon Territory were beginning to inspire others to follow the Oregon Trail west. Bush saw westward migration as a way to escape the increasing prejudice he and his family faced in Missouri. Bush was among the wealthier pioneers to follow the Oregon Trail. He was said to have supplied the Conestoga wagons with supplies that allowed some of the other families to make the trip. By the winter of 1846 to 1847, Bush had set up a grist mill at the Dutchess Falls. For the first time, the settlers could grind their own flour. The Simmons party joined a larger wagon train which departed Missouri May 1844. Bush's frontier experience made him a valuable addition to the train, which he helped lead across Great Plains and Rocky Mountains. In the summer of 1845, Simmons led an exploring party around the Puget Sound, while Bush and the other families remained in Columbia, where Bush had charge of the family's livestock. Bush found a site for a settlement at the falls where the Dutchess River enters Budd Inlet in what is now Thurston County. In October 1845, the Bush, Simmons, McAllister, Kinred, and Jones families, who were accompanied by 2 single men, Samuel Crockett and Jesse Ferguson, set off from Fort Vancouver for the Puget Sound. From there, they spent 15 days making a road through the forest to Budd Inlet, which they reached in early November. The Bushes and others settled up the Dutchess River a few miles south of the market on the fertile open prairie that soon became known as Bush Prairie. The Bush farm was located just off the highway running south from Tumwater to Colwitz Landing and Vancouver, so most new immigrants passed it on their way to Puget Sound. The newcomers were dependent on established settlers for food and seeds to start their own farms, and the Bush family was foremost in offering assistance. "Pay me in kind next year," he would say to those in need, and to those who had money he would say, "Don't take too much, just enough to do you." Ironically, the discriminatory laws the Bushes were trying to avoid had followed them and jeopardized their family's claim to the land they had cultivated and from which they fed the newly arriving immigrants. The 1845 American settlement north of the Columbia may have been one of the catalysts for the 1846 Treaty of Oregon, which resolved the U.S.-British boundary dispute by giving the territory south of the 49th parallel to the U.S., bringing what is now Washington under the Oregon Territory laws that denied rights to African Americans. When Washington Territory was separated from Oregon in 1853, many of the new legislators were friends and neighbors of the Bush family and benefited from their generosity. While this experience did not necessarily make them less prejudiced, it did persuade them to make an exception for Bush and his family. In the final years of his life, Bush continued to expand his farm and led the way in modernizing Puget Sound agriculture. At first, farming had been conducted almost entirely by hand, using a few simple tools carried overland in wagons. In 1856, Bush introduced the first mower. The next year, he brought in a thresher and separator. By the end of the decade, Bush and his sons were operating a model farm of 880 acres that was one of the leading operations in the territory. Bush died of a cerebral hemorrhage on April 5, 1863. His wife Isabella Bush died on September 12, 1866. Following George's death, their eldest son, William Owen Bush, returned from Grand Mound, where he had a farm, to take over the Bush Prairie homestead, which he operated until his death in 1907. His brothers also lived and worked the rest of their lives on the family land.